Howdy howdy everybody. I've been looking over some of the most anticipated games of 2024 videos that have been floating around lately, and I gotta say, there are only about 4 big games on the slate that I'm interested in. I'm getting the feeling 2024 is going to be a good year to replay some titles, try some new indies as they pop up, and take a plunge into the backlog. With all that in mind, I decided to revisit one of my old favorites. Created by Obsidian in a brisk 12-month production cycle and released in 2005, Star Wars: Knights of the Old Republic 2 – The Sith Lords is a sequel to BioWare's classic 2003 hit. It's a CRPG, operating on a D20 system, and bears a lot of similarities to Neverwinter Nights. It's a pretty well-known example of a rush job. The game released half-done, and it shows in a lot of places. In that sense, it was very ahead of its time. The game takes place 4,000 years before the Star Wars movies, and 5 years after the first Knights of the Old Republic. We aren't playing the character from the first game. Instead, a new player character is introduced, the Jedi Exile, a Jedi who followed Darth Revan into a war of extermination against the Mandalorians, and lost their connection to the Force after committing a planetary massacre. Although the actions of the character in the first game do factor in heavily with the plot, the player is able to determine those actions through dialogue options throughout the first chapter. I bought Knights of the Old Republic 2 through Steam. It's also available on GOG, and recently was ported on the Nintendo Switch. I've been hearing negative things about that Switch port, though. Let's dig into the gameplay. When I was growing up, I didn't have a lot of money to put towards games, so I spent my days sweating in the fields and my nights plugging in several dozen thousand hours playing the custom game modes of Warcraft 3, and later the custom servers of Neverwinter Nights 1 and 2. There's a certain feeling I always had when playing those custom servers. Everything was done to the best of someone's ability, driven by passion and imagination, but limited by the engine itself. Those games had a understanding with the player. Have a little patience, squint your eyes until the animations look right, and you'll experience something magical and unexpected. Knights of the Old Republic 2 has almost exactly the same feeling. If you're willing to work with the game, it's a great time. It also feels a lot like playing a Neverwinter Nights mod, mostly because it's running on a tweaked version of those same D&D 3.5 rules. Like most CRPGs, the Sith Lords does an insanely bad job of explaining how anything works. Every CRPG seems to assume you have some baseline experience with character building and understanding how feats, attributes, and skills interact. Almost every CRPG from this period also has bizarre mechanical bugs and description errors that make those interactions impossible to understand without a guide. This game simplifies character creation down to 3 classes, all of which are Jedi. The Jedi Guardian, a melee archetype, the Jedi Sentinel with a focus on skills, and the Jedi Consular, a space wizard. Classes affect combat but have almost no effect on how the story progresses. We gain additional skill points, choose new feats, and unlock the ability to use force powers as we level up. There are a lot of ways to build the character, and the game will play out at a very different difficulty depending on what you choose. A Guardian or a Sentinel that chooses feats poorly will likely need to lean on consumable items to survive, but a Consular who abuses the Force Lightning abilities will basically walk through the game unharmed. There are some pretty huge balance swings in this game. Most of the fights are fairly trivial if you've planned your character ahead to any degree, but there are a few sections where your main character is taken out of action, and suddenly you're playing a side character you're not used to and may not have equipped properly. There's no penalty for manually adjusting the difficulty, and I found myself dropping to easy on more than one occasion. Balance is centered around regularly crafting and installing upgrades into your gear. At higher levels, the upgrades installed into your weapons will double or triple their damage output. There's a robust loot system at play here, but all are tailor-made items, no randomly generated lightsaber of the boar +2 style equipment. Inventory management is a priority to keep yourself survivable, and focusing on item crafting and use can keep even a poorly built character alive. Combat is pretty unchanged from the first Knights of the Old Republic, and similar to pretty much all of the BioWare and Obsidian CRPGs. You've got your auto attack every turn, and a small menu above enemies that allows you to pick actions for the turn queue. These can be specialized attacks, such as critical hit, which may stun an enemy if it connects, or the player can use a force power or a consumable item like a grenade or health pack. The player is joined by 2 companions who can be controlled during combat, but they frequently forget the commands they're given and are generally pretty hard to wrangle. Unlike traditional D&D rules, there's no 8-hour rest to utilize, and the magic system is not locked to limited use slots, but is tied to a regenerating mana bar. There are also a few minigames, such as Pazak, which is sort of like Blackjack, and the turret sections. These feel unfinished, and don't often connect to the rest of the game in any meaningful way. We've also got a few puzzles to solve. One involves tracking down clues in the area to solve answers to a lore quiz, but for the most part the puzzles are simple spatial awareness challenges or algebra. I know this gameplay section could be seen as pretty negative, but this game really floods me with nostalgia, and I'm trying to acknowledge the shortcomings a new player would notice. Despite so many systems being unfinished and the presence of obviously unbalanced abilities, I still really enjoyed the combat. It's just cool. Playing as a Sith Lord, I shuffled between force choking to stun enemies and then closing in with a lightsaber, or completely clearing rooms with force lightning. Or playing as a Sentinel, I became one with the flurry of blows, and tried to see how many simultaneous critical hits I could rack up on opponents. There's a lot of bugs that need to be tolerated, but this kind of CRPG combat has a primal appeal, and I found myself completely absorbed in the adventure once again. A lot of this is down to exceptionally well-written characters, and the decision to examine the dichotomy of the Force from a more morally neutral perspective. The Sith Lords runs around 30 hours, and the most frustration I had with it was obtaining a lightsaber. The character's lightsaber is constructed from 4 pieces, which are obtained at certain points in the main plot, and as rewards during certain subquests. On my first recent playthrough, I didn't collect all 4 pieces until nearly 10 hours in. So for a whole third of the Star Wars game, where the only option is to play a Jedi, I was fighting with long swords and axes. It's a bit disenchanting, and contributes to the game feeling a bit like a D&D setting instead of Star Wars. On my second run, I was able to obtain the lightsaber in around 5 hours, but it's only really possible to obtain one that fast by knowing exactly which quests result in lightsaber parts ahead of time, and skipping a boatload of cutscenes. There are a total of 12 companion characters, with 10 obtainable in a playthrough. The character's gender will determine whether they recruit the handmaiden or the disciple, and the character's alignment determines which bounty hunter is recruited. Characters have robust backstories and generally have something in their past that is driving their behavior. As much as it's a game about trauma has become a running gag of modern gaming, Knights of the Old Republic 2 is a game about trauma. Nearly every companion has a tragic backstory that they are working through. Mostly they are recovering from their wartime actions or being imprisoned in some way. There's a system in place to gain influence with your party members, either by performing actions they like, or just talking to them and choosing answers that align with what they want to hear. It varies from one to another. If you're nice to the evil berserker Wookiee, he'll think you're weak and you'll lose influence. But the dashing scoundrel will appreciate a kind word and a wisecrack. As you max out influence, you'll be granted a tangible bonus to your character. These can be small boosts to attributes or some frankly overpowered feats. Becoming friends with the handmaiden allows you to add your wisdom bonus to your armor class, allowing a savvy counselor to become pretty untouchable. At the time of release, the press particularly noted Kreia as being an interesting addition to the Star Wars universe. It's true, Kreia really does drive the game with her maternalistic tutoring and attempts to disprove both the Jedi Code and Sith teachings. Even now, there really aren't any characters like her at all in gaming. But the true heart of Knights of the Old Republic 2 is the droids.
Recitation. Yes, as I said, I am an assassin droid. It is my primary function to burn holes through meat bags that you wish removed from the galaxy, Master.
Graphically, the game is not very impressive. A lot of our exploration is in areas that don't really make sense. Every area is bizarrely wide, flat, and empty. A lot of areas don't really look like Star Wars in any noticeable way, and overall there aren't very many unique animations to surprise you. Even in 2005 it looked dated, and it hasn't really gotten any better or worse. There are some odd bugs here and there. Seeing the teeth and eyes of holograms is unnerving for the entire game. Early on, the game focuses very heavily on in-engine cutscenes, and they are almost entirely framed as stand and talk shots, with neither character performing any action or really emoting. Visually, these get old pretty quickly, but the stasis directs your focus to the voice acting and writing, which are usually the crux of the scenes anyways. Voice acting is generally strong.
Piece of asteroid rock. Recitation? Oh yes, Master. The record of his last moments were...
5 droids, burning through the outer door. They're forcing their way into the bay. Please, someone that... Oh no, they're through! Oh, my leg! They're burning through my leg! Oh, stop! Stop, please!
The companion characters are all pretty stellar.
All wage war with the past, and it leaves its scars. I will not speak of yours, Atten, but there is a price for such things.
What? What price?
There are those who wage war, and those who follow them. You are a crude thing, murderer, but you have your uses. You know.
But there are some bit NPCs of varying competency. The score is pretty obviously a John Williams ripoff. But it's serviceable at recapturing the soundscape of the movies, and it's hard to imagine what this game would be if they hadn't included an orchestral score. Sometimes the sound simply won't play, or will skip ahead to a different effect. Sound effects on weapons are nice, but we don't get a lightsaber until almost halfway through the game. The first half sounds like a generic Lord of the Rings ripoff fantasy, with some sounds that I'm fairly sure are brought in straight from Neverwinter Nights. Up until we hear the lightsabers, it just feels incomplete. Spoiler warning for this 19-year-old game. I don't really want to describe the plot of Knights of the Old Republic 2 point for point. Ultimately, it's a story of connection. The Jedi exile begins the game alone, having become fully deaf to the Force, and the connection is only regained through willfully forming bonds with others, and killing a scrapyard worth of robots, and Sith, and random animals. There's some plot reasoning behind all of this. Although, like many of the game's themes and lore details, it's locked behind influence checks with companions. Essentially, the disconnection was caused by the Exiles' actions during the Mandalorian Wars. They activated a superweapon that destroyed the planet Malachor V, as a massive Jedi and Republic army was combating the Mandalorian forces there. The death of so many innocents, as well as the large number of soldiers and Jedi who were deleted, caused a sort of scream in the Force that hollowed out the Exile, and the emptiness they carry is an echo of that scream. The Exile has some sort of relatively unique Force bonding ability, wherein they are connected via the Force to pretty much everything they interact with in a very literal way. When they kill, they are absorbing the power of the creatures through that bond, a tidy excuse for an experience system. But by deepening the bonds with your companions, you can grow even stronger, represented in-game by the stat boosts and various feats I mentioned earlier. There's no strong measure in-game for the influence. The closest way to tell is to see if the companion's alignment matches yours, as the Force bond seems to slowly give you control over the way the characters behave and believe.
What? What just happened? 1 minute we're just talking and then...
This leads us to Kreia. From the beginning, she develops an especially strong connection with the Exile, and spends most of the game tutoring the character on how to act. However, the Force bond doesn't seem to adjust her behavior, as her alignment is always set as true neutral. It's pretty obvious from the start that she is actually evil. They give some huge clues a little too soon, such as her surviving a fight with Darth Sion. There's an attempt to make her seem morally gray by having her disagree with the Sith as well as the Jedi, but in practice, she just comes off as that type of evil that schemes against other evil.
One does not need to be Jedi to learn the ways of the Force. I suspect it cares little for our codes and philosophies.
The game loses a bit of steam once you're free of Telos and allowed to pick from the 4 remaining planets. There is a pretty huge variation in quality between the 4. Korriban is a 30-minute dungeon pit stop, whereas Nar Shaddaa and Onderon have fully fledged plot lines to carry through them. Dantooine is a bit of a mess, as it feels like it switches objectives right in the middle, but it does have a memorable siege sequence. The main goal of these visits is to either rescue or kill the remaining Jedi Council who are hidden on these planets. Either option teaches you their skill sets, and ultimately it's a meaningless choice, as Kreia will kill them regardless when she reveals herself as a Sith, Darth Treya. It's truly a shockingly bad name. And then we arrive at the most unfinished section of the game, where we are railroaded between boss fights. The last third is extremely combat heavy, and the quality of dialogue really drops off. It's a bit of a bummer to end on that note, but it all felt new to me on replay because I did not remember any of the ending sequence. Ultimately, the strong dialogue and momentum in the first sections of the game do well to carry the game's reputation, but I don't think too many people would claim it's a perfect game. It is very good, even if you weren't aware of the studio's time constraints, and even in 2024 it was well worth the playthrough. I had a lot of fun replaying it again, but I can't imagine how it would be received by someone who isn't carrying so much nostalgia for this period of D&D styled real-time CRPGs. I'm not going to bother with any sort of rating of this game. It's a classic to me. It's got flaws, and yet I've still played it half a dozen times. Well, that's my 12th review. Thanks for tuning in. See you!